The group arrived at Bleakhaven Manor just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house loomed against the crimson sky, its tall broken windows like hollow eyes. Ivy crept up its crumbling facade, and the iron gate creaked ominously as Simon pushed it open. "Are we seriously doing this?"
Mia asked, clutching her necklace of protective crystals.
"Of course," Mark said with a grin. "It's just an old house." Eliza smirked, holding up her camera. "Let's capture the truth." Inside, the air was heavy, damp, and reeked of mildew. The wooden floor groaned under their feet, and the walls were adorned with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The group set up their equipment in the grand hall, a cavernous room with a massive chandelier that swayed slightly despite the lack of wind. Simon placed sensors to detect movement, while Eliza recorded her thoughts on camera. "I don't feel right here," Mia said softly. "The air is angry. Angry air." "Got it," Mark joked, but his laughter sounded hollow. As the night deepened, strange things began to happen. Faint whispers echoed through the hallways, but no one could understand the words. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breaths visible in the dim lantern light. Then the chandelier rattled, its chains groaning. "Did you feel that?" Simon asked, checking his sensors. "Maybe it's the wind," Eliza offered, though she didn't believe it. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices. One voice stood out, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Leave." Chapter 3: The Locked Room. Mark, ever the adventurer, decided to explore alone despite Mia's protests. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured down a narrow corridor, finding a door with deep claw marks gouged into the wood. "It's probably just rats," he muttered, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was unnaturally cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the plaster, and in the center stood a rotting crib. As Mark approached, he heard faint crying, soft but unmistakable. "Guys?" he called out, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the room. The crying grew louder, turning into agonized wailing. Then the crib began to rock violently on its own. Mark stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. In the beam of light, he saw a figure, a gaunt, hollow-eyed child with black empty sockets for eyes. Before Mark could scream, the door slammed shut. Mark, ever the adventurer, decided to explore alone despite Mia's protests. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured down a narrow corridor, finding a door with deep claw marks gouged into the wood. "It's probably just rats," he muttered, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was unnaturally cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the plaster, and in the center stood a rotting crib. As Mark approached, he heard faint crying, soft but unmistakable. "Guys?" he called out, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the room. The crying grew louder, turning into agonized wailing. Then the crib began to rock violently on its own. Mark stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. In the beam of light, he saw a figure, a gaunt, hollow-eyed child with black, empty sockets for eyes. Before Mark could scream, the door slammed shut. Back in the grand hall, Eliza and the others heard the slam and Mark's muffled screams. They rushed to the corridor, only to find the door locked tight. "Mark, are you in there?" Simon shouted, slamming his shoulder against the door. From behind them came a wet, gurgling sound. The group turned to see the shadows on the wall shifting, elongating into grotesque, clawed figures. The walls themselves seemed to pulse like lungs inhaling and exhaling. "The house. It's alive," Mia whispered, clutching her crystals. The whispers returned, louder and angrier. The chandelier crashed to the floor, sending shards of glass flying. A guttural voice echoed through the hall. "You should not have come." Simon managed to force the door open, and they found Mark huddled in a corner, muttering incoherently. His eyes were wide with terror, his hands clawing at his own arms as if trying to remove something unseen. Eliza insisted they couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. Despite their terror, they followed her lead to the basement, where Mia claimed she felt a presence. The basement stairs creaked with every step, the air growing colder and thicker. At the bottom, they found a large stone altar stained with dark, dried blood. Around it were skeletal remains, their bones twisted unnaturally. This is a ritual site, Mia said, her voice trembling. The house, it's feeding on us. Suddenly, the lanterns went out. The only light came from the faint, sickly glow of the altar. Shadows swirled around them, and the guttural voice returned, louder than ever, "You cannot leave." One by one, the group was separated. Simon was dragged into the darkness, his screams echoing. Mia collapsed, clutching her head as if trying to block out the whispers. Eliza grabbed Mark, pulling him toward the stairs. Eliza and Mark found themselves back in the grand hall, but it had changed. The walls were covered in pulsating, fleshy growths, and the portraits now depicted their own terrified faces. "Eliza," Mark whispered, pointing to the largest portrait. In it, Eliza was screaming, blood pouring from her eyes. The house began to shake, its voice roaring, "You will stay. You belong to me." Eliza realized the house wasn't just alive, it was a predator, and they were its prey. She remembered the symbols Mark had described in the locked room. If she could destroy them, maybe they could escape. With Mark's help, Eliza found the locked room again. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers. Using a broken piece of wood, she began to scratch out the carvings. The house screamed in protest, the walls cracking and bleeding. Mark was pulled away by an unseen force, leaving Eliza alone. As she destroyed the final symbol, the house let out a deafening roar. The ground shook violently and the walls began to collapse. Eliza ran, dodging falling debris. She burst through the front door just as the house imploded, swallowing itself in a cloud of dust and shadow. Eliza woke up in a hospital, her body bruised and battered. Mark and Simon were never found. Mia was catatonic, her mind trapped in the whispers. Eliza's story became a sensation, but she knew the truth wasn't over. At night, she could still hear the faint sound of breathing, as if the house was calling her back.